Reminder, I like for you guys to interject and ask questions. So it'd be maybe a little more, uh, or it could be a little more lecture side. It doesn't have to be, but like it's. Please feel free to get the interaction that you want. And also, just point out stuff and ask questions. In the background, you might hear my dog. You're gonna hear my uh Roxy, no, Roxy, Roxy. You'll hear the laundry. The last thing is, like depending on what you're comfortable with, if you have questions, normally what I do is I cut out the questions of the students whenever I have to put something online. But it's up to you. Like if you uh are okay with me not doing that, I won't do that. Hey, babe, stop. All right, let's get started. So, um, James Madison, you guys have some experience with him. Who, if you haven't read Madison, say, I haven't read Madison. You, yeah, you have. Good, right? So he's kind of considered to be the founding father of the Constitution. There's obviously lots of founding fathers. He's the guy that came up with the design. And he was really young when he did it. He did some cool stuff, like he looked at all of these ancient regimes, and then he looked at all these modern regimes, and he tried to see which ones, like, why did they fail? Basically, he's troubleshooting politics. And he set up the whole thing, right? The structure of the Constitution, but also like our our incentives, because his idea is that we have incentives for how we act politically, and that's the way to manage what we do. Other regimes, and this is really important, like if you're taking notes, I'd write it down. In the past, people used to think that regimes should be created based on our aspirations, what we think we can use law to turn people into. And so governments could be a high bar. Like their job was to basically set a high bar. And Madison's approach is more like, okay, we aren't going to be able to change the reasons people have for acting. This is his basic insight. We're not going to be able to change why people act. People act, he says, because of self-interest. And really no more, no less than that. So you're not going to get anywhere if you don't accept that. So what you actually have to do is you have to set government up like a machine. And the machine is going to be something that basically uses that energy or that battery of self-interest and ends up with good results, right? So how do you lure, how do you shape self-interest to be something that can leave us with a good product? And it's almost like a behavior plan. I don't know how many of you know much about education, or have you've had experience with raising kids, or watching kids. Like part of understanding that is understanding what motivates the kid and setting things up to where they are basically, you're setting them up for success, or you're setting things up for the household to work out. That's kind of what Madison's Constitution is, and it's really pedestrian in that way. Like, we think about government as being super high and vaulted and things like that, and it is. But he's got this real practical approach that is super different. Now, one question you could have is, why are we even studying this that is supposed to be more contemporary? That's probably something that crossed your mind. It certainly would be something that crossed mine. Let me see. Do I? I wanted to draw something for you, and now I don't think I can. Whiteboards. New whiteboard. Let's see how I do with this. Okay, guys. All right. So, um, why even deal with this? Okay. Well, because of something called faction. And here, I'm going to turn off our recording so we can talk to each other about what faction is. Why does that even matter for American politics? So go ahead and let's pipe up. So, faction, you're exactly right, has a relationship to majorities and minorities. And in a republic, in a democratic republic, you're supposed to have a one person, one vote thing going on, at least on some level. So Madison's going to break it up, right? Because he has the federal structure of the states, and then he has senators. They're not directly elected, they're appointed. And of course, we all know that you had to be a white property holder at this time to vote. So it's not one to one in the way that we think about it now, but in the way they thought about it then, and in some sort of, I guess, reductive sense. A Republican form of government, small r Republican, is based on the idea of representation of the individual, right, having some representative correspondent. If you're white and you are a property owner, you get a vote. Now, what's the problem? The problem is that because of factions, even when you have this one to one ratio going on, it can end up looking really different. Because if you've got factions that are like, here's a faction, and they're all like building up together, da 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 da, and it's all these people with their one to one vote making like a big block. And then there's like two people over here, right, who like have their vote. It's like, okay, this government is supposed to be representative, but here's the problem. When you do a one to one representation, if people get hooked up with each other because they've got the same kind of passion or selfish interest, then that one to one, I'm sort of getting my interests considered in a fair way thing disappears because it becomes a situation where power, you used to, in the old days, what was the problem with the king? Well, the problem with the king was that he was a tyrant. He was too powerful. He was more powerful. This is what Madison would say, than the rest of the polity. Everybody else's needs weren't considered because his were so heavy, they had so much weight. Madison's insight is that this happens in democracy too. That you think that you're avoiding the problem that kings can present, where their interests start to dominate the public square. But you're placing it with a different problem, which is that you can have people animated by these bad interests who they start to take up all the space of the public square and they start to distort representation. And the issue there is, of course, that in a monarchy, at least you can say it's a king that rules us. In a democracy, you're not supposed to be ruled by any sort of outside heavy weight thing that cancels out all your interests. That's the point of democracy. It's supposed to be responsive to you. And because of factions, it's very easy for Republican forms of government to become the same as a tyrannical king. You will have majorities tyrannize minorities. And here, it's important to say what majorities can mean because there's two senses of majorities in this way. Majority can just mean a numerical majority, right? That there's more people who have this opinion or this interest or whatever. But a majority can also mean a majority of power. And so in the United States, there have always been cases that something is a minority that actually has a numerical majority. It's just that what makes them a minority is their access to influence. And so majorities can be numerical, majorities can also be in terms of voting blocks or interests that just have outsized power. And this sounds like an insight that gets picked up a lot in 20th century American thought, but it's one that goes back to the founding. Um, because on the one hand, Madison's going to be worried about the tyranny of the majority, meaning the majority of, like, he was really worried about people who didn't own property taking away money from people who did own property. And the thing is, people who don't own property, there were more of those, or at least who own less property, there were more of those than the rich. That fits the more kind of straightforward understanding of majorities. But the other thing he was worried about, believe it or not, in his papers and his journals and private correspondence, he was really worried about slavery. And he saw that in the South, um, slave owners were a minority. And in the long run, the slave population was going to get fairly large. It was really clear um, in the US. Even that's part of why he put that provision in the Constitution to shut down the slave trade, not to end slavery, but to shut down the slave trade um, to the US, to the ports. So even though in terms of numbers, there might be more slaves, or at least there were minimally, like in terms of numbers, the number of slave owners is more minimal. But he knows that the person who is the majority there in terms of power is the slave owner. So we already see this very, very easily. Factions are always, this is really important for him. Factions are always connected to a passion. I'd write that down. For him, a passion is always negative. So there's no good way to have a faction ever. Like, it's just not going to happen um for us, because it automatically means that you have a group of people together that are driven by selfishness to the point that they're a threat to the rest of the social order. So, all of that being said, does it strike you as a sort of contradiction in his thought that on the one hand, he wants to talk about us in terms of being fundamentally selfish, and on the other hand, he wants to talk about the biggest threat to democracy being um, faction? And I'll press pause again. Okay, let's take a little walk through Federalist 10. Okay. So faction, we said, is the fundamental problem of what we're inclined to, and it can be a matter of numbers, but those numbers they don't have to translate into majority or minority in the way that we talked about, right? You can have majorities that actually, strictly speaking, are numerical minorities. Um, and anything that is a faction is something that's united and motivated by a common impulse, passion, or interest that is adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent interest of the community. So, again, it's not like you're going to have a bunch of soccer fans that are considered a faction. It has to be something nefarious. Nefarious. Can a faction be good? By definition, no. There's not going to be any good instance of a faction. Well, then this is kind of what you're saying, Pablo, about that if you go further into it, if there's no sense in which a faction can be good, then how can having factions mean we could ever have good government? Well, like you said, he thinks if you dilute the power of factions by increasing lots of them, then you end the threat. So you're taking like a bad medicine to get a good result. And here I just want to add that the idea of making power diffuse into different compartments is a huge part of Madison's theory generally. It's why he is interested in this extension of the Republic and all the opinions that come with that. And he's interested in the federal system of splitting power between states and the federal government, and then of sharing power in the three branches as well. It's a common theme for him. And this is because everybody thinks that the way you would handle factions, the sort of common sense answer is that, well, you take away people's ability to make factions. You take away people's ability to make factions by taking away their political freedom. You take away their speech. You take away their conscience rights. You take away their assembly. And in doing so, you're not going to be able to change necessarily what's on the inside of them, but you are going to be able to change what they express and how they act on the outside. You could give them theoretically the same external passions. Okay. You take away their political liberty and you can make everybody the same. Same passions, same opinions, same interests. But the problem is that Madison thinks we're by nature free. So because of the type of beings that we are, which are reasoning beings, our consent and our decision making is important. When a government takes away things like speech and assembly, they're basically acting like a tyrant toward us. So no solution could destroy political liberty and be just for him. But this also yields the insight that part of our nature is we're free. Sounds like a good thing, right? And it is a good thing. But for him, it is a good thing. Like we're naturally free. That's good. We're in addition to being naturally free, we're also naturally factious. And so for him, you're dealing with a mixed bag in the human from the start. So factions being a part of our nature, you can't erase them. You can't erase the factions out of our nature any more than it would be right to erase our political liberties from who we are. What you need to do, he thinks, is to have the ability to make um, clever tricks, clever government structures that can outsmart these bad parts of our nature. The easy case, of course, being when there's a minority faction. That's easy. All you got to do is outvote it. As long as it's the case that gerrymandering and things like that aren't going on, right, where there's interference with votes, then when there's a minority faction that's causing trouble, it's easy to manage. You go out and you vote. What the remedy for majority faction is, though, isn't, as he said above, the false remedy, which is to destroy public liberty, But it is everything else he talks about in Federalist 10, which is this dilution argument that Pablo brought up. So, two goals. Um, you need to, in this situation, when you've got a government that is over people who by nature are free, but also by nature are factious, what do you have to do? You have to set the government up in a way where you keep them from having the same interests and the same passion in the first place. Okay. You also try to keep them from discovering the same interests and discovering the same passion in the first place. And things that people rely on, like religion and morality, they're not effective, Madison says. In fact, a lot of times what happens is that people who have a bad interest or bad impulse, they can spin religion and morality into justifications for what they're doing. So those things aren't even checks. The checks are don't let them have the same interest and passion, and don't let them find out they have the same interest and passion. Um, the the problem is though that democracy itself makes it more likely that we will participate in factions. Like human nature is factious. We already know that. He's telling us that like up front. But he even thinks that we get more prone to doing that when we get the chance to be Democrats, small d Democrats. Why? So I think basically one of the things Madison's kind of worried about is the Democratic, small d Democratic resort to something called kayfabe. And kayfabe is something that comes out of wrestling, out of the WWE and things like that. Where kayfabe is when you've got basically characters, and you might have the hero, and then you have the heel, or like kind of the sleazy guy, and then you have the villain, and then they're all engaged in this big public battle. Everyone has a part to play. The parts to play are really easy to understand. They kind of tap into archaic types of humans that you see like in Greek drama or whatever. Like your brain can reach it. And so instead of having actual wrestling matches, what they have is basically wrestling soap operas. And that's the kayfabe part of it, is the way that to generate that conflict and to make that conflict interesting, you will do things like pretend to hate another person or pretend to help another person, but then you're not actually going to help them. You're going to betray them in the end because you want the drama. Okay. There's a soap opera aspect to that type of public art and public performance. And democratic politics, small d democratic politics, relies a lot. It can rely a lot in its most simplistic forms on kayfabe. And that becomes stuff that also is really easy to be consumed through social media, really easy to be consumed through, I don't know, podcasts, really easy to be consumed even from in terms of the PR of what governments or government actors put out from their own offices. But in the old days, there was even kayfabe. Like I don't know how many of you are familiar with Alexander Hamilton, and his affair. And so they like wanted to set him up and expose him for his affair. After they originally were trying to expose him for what they thought was embezzlement, his political enemies like Jefferson. And up to that point, there'd been all kinds of mudslinging. And actually mudslinging continued for a long time. Like there were cartoons and stuff when Madison's wife was the first lady about how she was really a prostitute that was taking diplomats to be her Johns, and like it was wild. I think we don't know how wild it is. And so Alexander Hamilton tries to get out front of it by publishing a letter basically confessing to his affair and making it all public. And at first, it looks like that's going to hurt him, and it does hurt him. But in the end, all of the drama of it and the ongoing tensions between the left and the right at the time in the nation, in the end, he gets pulled back into the core of political drama in the US because, again, it's what the stories that keep our attention and the passions that it animates that can really guide our political action. So, democracy itself, in a lot of ways, takes those parts of us that are more self interested and more factious and makes them louder. Okay. Not just our selfishness louder, but our our enjoyment of or attention to conflict and struggle get louder too. So, Madison's perspective is okay, if to honor our nature, which is at once faction driven, and on the other, it has this natural freedom and this natural dignity and freedom that the government has to regard. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to extend representative democracy over a larger area. Um, so we need to get representatives involved. And those representatives, instead of people voting directly, you need to have enlightened people who will take the sort of normie opinions and then turn the normie opinions into a better version of what they are. If we live in a big country, he actually thinks that becomes more likely because the bigger we get, the more people we have to choose from. So he thinks, for example, that if we have to pick someone to lead us and we're confined to San Marcos, maybe we won't find anybody. But if we get to expand to, like, I don't know, like to Austin and then down to New Braunfels and maybe to Wimberley or whatever, we get more people. And just it becomes an odds game. It becomes our chances are higher. And even if extending the pool like that won't help, well, like just if you have a bigger playing field at all, you're going to get more opinions, more types of opinions that are different from each other. And they'll have to fight with each other, he thinks. So, size and increasing the number of factions kind of takes away, potentially, the sting of the faction. Now, this is what a lot of people think about this theory today. These are the advantages of the extended republic argument that he's talking about. in Federalist 10 and then in Federalist 51, which you prepared. Um, they think it leads to more liberty. They think it leads to more flexibility. Ostensibly, it leads to experimentation. So I don't know how familiar you guys are with, like, well, like when I was younger, everybody really hated marijuana. They thought it was really dangerous. And they thought it was a gateway drug to all the other drugs. So like the idea was you can't let anybody smoke marijuana ever. Or else we will all be addicted to cocaine. And then people started to push back on that idea for different reasons. Like they'd say, no, marijuana's not that bad, or it's only bad for some people, or da 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 da. And what happened was enough that opinion grew enough in the nation that not everybody who thought that way was going to get to participate in that experiment, but some states, because we have this federal structure, became places where they basically said, let's try out legalizing pot and see what happens, right? What if we legalize marijuana, and what if we like monitor how it's grown, and we monitor how it's dispensed, and then we monitor how it's consumed? Will we end up in a spot where everybody's going to be a pothead, and like there's going to be no productivity whatsoever, and then everybody's going to end up on meth and crack because marijuana is a gateway drug? Well, if that happens, it's only going to happen in this state, in that state, right? um and that was kind of a big thing at the time. I mean, people are still figuring this stuff out, right? But part of the reason that ideas around marijuana even began to change is because popular opinion about marijuana could become expressed and experimented with through our federal system, because we have such a big nation. We could say we're going to have some places where we take this risk, and we don't fear that the whole thing will fall apart. And then some states would see what happened in the states that tried it, and they started to liberalize their laws. Okay, so um, democratic participation is another advantage. Like, theoretically, if you don't like the politics of Texas, there's nothing to stop you from moving to Massachusetts. There's nothing to stop you from moving to a place you do agree with. California had a mass exodus, basically, of people who are more conservative coming to Texas because they weren't going to change California. But because we live in an extended republic, they could come and be citizens in a part of the nation that they agreed with more. And in fact, there are some studies that show that their coming here really changed the character of the law here, because they tended to be to the right of some Texans. Um, and another reason, right, that people in the contemporary world like Federalist 10 and Federalist 15, or things about Federalist 10 and Federalist 15, is because theoretically it should encourage more diversity. America has always had many strains in it. There's tons of work done on the founding era up until the present about different currents, different reasons people have for wanting to be American, or how they think politically as Americans, or what they consider American values to be. And because there's not a lot of agreement, and people could butt heads because of that, um, having a large space, in theory, and having the freedom to move around within that space uh, is supposed to be a benefit or a relief valve to the problems of faction in the 21st century. Let's talk about the disadvantages. And the disadvantages are fairly clear. Um, when factions, even if they're controlled, or controlled's not the right word, even when the conditions of factions are such that you're supposed to be able to have them pitted against one another in a way that's productive. Um, even if when that's working at its best, it it still doesn't create unity. Even when that's going how you want it to go, you're still going to have this issue, which is that there's theoretically one nation that we're all inhabiting. And then, in order to make the system work, we have to kind of let the factions operate. Um, and as long as that's the case, it's very difficult to get anything other than polarization, other than, there's an absence of an identification with a common thing. Another problem some people see in this arrangement in the 21st century is that it can lead to situations where local governments can local governments or factions of uh, government that are lower than the federal or federal initiatives can have a lot of power, even if their numbers are not large. We rely on a lot of mechanisms that uh, give local and state factions power that can interrupt national decisions. And the classic example here, for our purposes in the 20th century, is of um, any attempts of the federal government. The two that really are the most prominent in our history are things about labor. So, for example, when there would be movements to end child labor, or movements to implement like fair wage standards, or movements to implement fair labor standards. If you could get those movements to have energy and even legislation or some kind of political authority on the federal level, because of the way that our extended republic is structured, states can basically block those initiatives. So even if you have a federal intention, if there's a state that didn't want to change its child labor laws, they could stop the whole process. Really, they could stop child labor from being regulated. Uh, the same thing, of course, happened with the civil rights movement and anything having to do with integration. You could have these federal level initiatives and federal level policies, but because of the way that we kind of planted power to counteract power, in an extended republic, states that don't want to integrate, or don't want to follow certain policies can threaten the entire project. So that's another sort of disadvantage of the Madisonian extended republic argument that is endemic in the 20th century. Uh, the bullet point there is permitted racial discrimination is what I was just talking about too. So those bullet points are connected. You can also have a problem where access to law enforcement, access to resources, access to certain types of justice or legal representation are very uneven. Because in theory, everyone should have those things um, because of certain federal uh, policies or protections. But when things are so extended and so diluted, it's very easy to not have any oversight over how things like law and justice and resources are meted out or applied. Um, and so those are kind of ways that this theory in the 20th century and in our century runs up into a lot of criticism. Money plays a big role in this, and I won't get into that too much. But the last question I'll have for you, and I'll pause it here if you want to talk about it, is this argument of the extended republic and of the way of breaking power up across the nation, right? By having faction counteract faction. Uh, and I should add, because it's been in the background the whole time, checks and balances are like a mirror of that, right? Because the idea is you empower each of the branches of the government to behave like factions. The idea being that the Constitution is set up so that even when they behave like factions in pursuing their own interests, their conflict will produce a harmonious response, right? So, my question is, we've built our government around both when we're talking about the horizontal way and then um, the vertical way, federalism way, horizontal way, just like the common popular opinion spread out, federalism, horizontal way, and then this sort of top tier, three branches counteracting each other, ambition counteracting ambition way. All of that whole structure that I just described. It's predicated on our factions being used as fuel in a way that in the end benefits all of us. Madison thinks that he's figured out the institutional way to achieve this on all the levels described. Um, because he thinks that part of us is never going to go away. So why not found on it, so to speak? Do we think his approach still works in an age of the internet? Okay, I'm going to turn off the recording now, but I mean, the internet is actually a big threat to this theory, or it could be. But why? Let's talk about why. Okay, it's paused. It's paused, so you guys can jump in now. Basically, this idea that we can kind of just let I was gonna say let our freak flag fly, but that's not what I mean. I mean, we could he's like, let it all out, right? Like, let it out. Let those factions bloom, right? And then we've got all of these checks to turn that into something that generates harmony and good government. How does social media interface with that? Like, can that approach survive a social media age? Whiteboard. Okay, right. Yeah, this is a really interesting thing. Um, so like on the internet, everybody gets to say their opinion, right? And actually, even robots get to say their opinions. Um, and then people find each other. Like someone in Oregon has this opinion that's really wild. And like maybe they don't know anyone in their home that has that opinion. But they found someone in Texas that does. Okay, so everyone feels like they can put their opinion out there. Everyone gets like unmediated access to doing so. Then we also get to find each other when we might not have found each other before. Um, and then you pointed out to kind of the odd thing here that I think Madison wouldn't know what to do with. Because I think Madison would say, okay, yeah, you're increasing opinion. Um, so you're increasing variety. And then technology mediates it to where that bigger reality, that reality that is filled with more variety of opinion, media makes it possible for people to find each other and pair up with that opinion. Okay, so there's more opinion and then more factions. And he might say, well, that's okay because this is just another version of my theory, right? This is just my theory on steroids. It's just the garden of factions growing. We're just extending it even more. But you brought up what I think is a really and unpredicted problem that technology poses for Madison's adventure, the problem of the echo chamber. So instead of all of these opinions basically leading to this garden that we all see and inhabit, um, and that we can choose between the things in that garden, and the garden kind of has to duke it out, has to fight each other, has to see each other even, and deal with each other. Instead of that happening, what the internet does, you're suggesting, is that you get more opinions, perhaps more radical opinions, and then you have a more of an ability to find the opinion, which wasn't there before. But once you find it, you get to self-select into a space where you only ever have to hear the opinions you choose. You leave the space of the extended republic's growing, multiplying opinions and factions. You basically are like, I found my people. I found my group that sees the world the way I do. And all the information you receive from that point on is interpreted through the lens of what you've selected into. And so the extended republic argument, I think, in the way that you've set it up for us, which is really insightful, it starts to fall apart. But we've never had the option of just withdrawing from the competition and and space of factions having to engage with each other on some level altogether. We've never done that. And now we do have that option. Which also means that once you hop into that space, that echo chamber space, you've withdrawn yourself from the extended republic. And, oh, yes, what is it?
Here we ended with a really interesting student question about what happens when we combine these echo chambers with COVID and the socialization that certain generations got from COVID. How does that impact, even if people want to socialize, maybe they don't know how. Maybe it's more comforting to be in an echo chamber, or maybe it's what is natural in a way because it's what is learned. And if that's the case, what does that mean for the future?